I wonder if you can comment at all on, I keep trying to throw it in there, but there's other arms of medicine where there's more the consequences are perhaps less dire. Like psych meds strike me as a really interesting one because especially we've seen a lot in the news lately, and I don't really know the details, but it seems like some of the SSRIs just don't really stop depression. But we've been prescribing them for years. Some of the side effects do seem to include death, not in like a toxicity format, but in terms of people taking their own lives. Um, do you think that those situations are more open to corruptions than something that's life and death, where the outcome is kind of squishy and there's long term effects? The patients aren't expected to not survive for a couple of years. Like they're going to live a full life. They're just not feeling right, or they're having
Yeah,
behavioral issues.
that's a good kind of segue back to talking a little bit more about the FDA.
Yeah.
There is gamesmanship that happens in how trials are designed, and there are, I'm not going to say um, every single company does this, but often drug companies will design a trial for the lowest common denominator of getting a drug approved. So, and you see this in my world. There's one classic example is that there are a bunch of trials that have been conducted in a type of leukemia called chronic lymphocytic leukemia, where a company chose what was considered a standard of care 20 years ago as a comparator arm, but wouldn't be considered a standard of care today. But the FDA accepted that as a standard comparator arm.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, who do these people hand in their reports at the end to? Does it go to the FDA? That's the final. That's where these clinical trials
Sure. So,
are
so taking it
adjudicated.
in a couple of different directions. If you're earlier when we left off, kind of in talking about clinical trials, we went through the different phases of clinical trials. Often the FDA really wants a randomized trial that can lead to a drug's approval, where you're looking at a new drug, tumor versus the standard, or a new combination of drugs. So maybe it's the standard plus tumor versus the standard. And you're looking for an endpoint that indicates that somebody lives longer or lives better, right? Just like we talked about before. And that needs to reach statistical significance. And sometimes the FDA and the company will come to an agreement on what they consider to be a meaningful endpoint. We talk about this as a clinically meaningful endpoint. And sometimes, but most of the time, they don't come to that agreement.
What was the negotiation like in the case of that the CLL drug that you were talking about?
So
Did
I
they?
wasn't part of those
Mm-hmm.
negotiations, but what they're going to do, for certain trials, the FDA is going to say we really want you to show that your drug allows people to live longer. For other trials, the FDA will accept something different, like what you mentioned before, progression-free survival, particularly if it's a disease that somebody lives with for years. So, for example, in the chronic lymphocytic leukemia, the CLL trials, somebody with an early stage CLL might live 15 years. So, to design a trial that shows that they live 16 years instead of 15 years is going to take the natural history of the investigator, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
basically starting your career and then ending it with the conclusion of the trial.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone recognizes that's ridiculous. So in that case, the FDA will accept an interim marker of that clinically meaningful benefit. And maybe for that, they will say progression-free survival is good enough. Because if we wait for overall survival, we're all going to be retired.
Mm.
Mm. And then the hope is somebody's going to follow up on that later. Like, do they have to renew their lease on this thing at some point, or down the road? And
Generally, so that's a great question. So what do they do for follow-up? They generally do not expect that survival data are eventually going to get published in 2 decades. It's nice if it does. So sometimes people will go back and try to see if they can identify overall survival, but often they're no longer following these patients, so they can't track them.
it's really
What's the
interesting.
length of time that normally survival is tracked?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah. So on a clinical trial, most clinical trials will track it for 5 years, and then they say we're done. Why? Because the company has to pay for that tracking to continue.
Right.
Yeah,
So
and
the trick becomes when you have a disease like metastatic breast cancer, where you could measure it in overall survival, but instead a company wants to focus on progression-free survival, something that's earlier. Why? Because it takes a shorter amount of time. They have to spend less money on a big trial. Some large trials that enroll hundreds of patients, the operating cost is $1 million a day.
wow.
So if you design a study where you can figure out progression-free survival in 2 years versus overall survival, which might take 3.5 years, you do the math, right? So it's now you're talking about something that's $500 million more expensive than focusing on progression-free survival if you use the $1 million a day marker.
Is that just because it's like got all these centers and you have all these staff costs and what is?
Yeah,
That's crazy. It's huge. I guess they're making billions of dollars off of these drugs potentially. So you
right.
know.
So in the case of the trial that I talk about in drugs in the FDA is the breast cancer drug Avastin. The breast cancer drug Avastin was bringing in $1 billion a year to Genentech. It was $1 billion a year drug. So sure, research and development costs are a lot. Running that large phase 3 trial is a lot. But when you compare it to $1 billion a year, they make up those costs pretty quickly.